what we found was that bird eggs at Bellow Island were so thin they were cracking. Same problem that had occurred with eagles. To a lesser extent, that happened also in Green Bay that year. This was 1965. When we analyzed the eggs, we were looking at close to 100 parts per million of DDT. The lethal dose for chicken eggs in DDT is about 20. And we were looking at 5 times that much in these herring gulls at the time. Much less out in the Beaver Islands at that control colony. My job was to look at that, and I documented it, photographed it, took some 16 millimeter pictures just like you're doing now. What we chronicled over the next decade was the collapse of that colony from about 2,500 nests down to 500. And thin-shelled eggs, some birds coming back to nest where you had female-female pairs, where females had been feminized by exposure to the estrogen effects of DDT, all sorts of stuff. And that data was used by the Environmental Defense Fund as one of 3 examples of DDT problems that were occurring nationwide that led to the ban of DDT. It was part of their case, their legal case. So I've been at this a long time. Well, when the fisheries collapsed, from a political standpoint, there is a need for the fisheries people to demonstrate that they are doing something to help fisheries recover. Cormorants are big black birds. They've been demonized for millennia. Actually, they're referred to in the Bible, along with other foods like pork that you're not supposed to eat. What modern Americans and Canadians do not understand is that the Great Lakes they have seen are by no means natural. They are the result of 2 centuries of forced human change. One of the major things that went on, particularly from about 1850 to 1900, was killing of almost any bird, large bird, for feathers. So when you look at what we had in 1900, about the time this episode quit, and we started into a conservation ethic in this country and in North America, along with Teddy Roosevelt and the first national parks in both countries. By that time, there was very, very paltry numbers of any of these water birds left. They had been pretty well exterminated. And the fact that they're coming back now or have come back, it actually should be viewed as a good news story. But there are conflicts with people, particularly with fisheries, over cormorants. I think a lot of it's misplaced and a lot of it's misunderstood. But you just have to understand that what we think of as normal, put it in quotes, is not normal. It's completely different than what it was 200 years ago, what it was 50 years ago. We think that based on the data we had in the late 90s, that the population probably pretty well peaked out at somewhere around 1998. And that was just at the time that the alewives were really starting to collapse. And coincident with that, or actually just a little bit before it, the smelt had pretty well collapsed, particularly in Lakes Huron and Michigan. And then a little fish called the sticklebacks, they collapsed. So all 3 of these species that were essentially the cornerstones of not just bird populations, but the cornerstones for many of the game fish, suddenly became almost rare. And the result was that things like salmon started to starve. All sorts of things began to change simultaneously. One of the changes that happened early was the vast increase in the number of cormorants, but now there's been a vast decrease in the number of cormorants. In the last few years we've been looking at it, and every year we've looked at it since 2015 in all of Lake Huron, for example. The population's dropped each year by First year it dropped 14%. This last year it dropped 17%. So cormorants are suffering just along with everything else. And I think it's a matter of food, primarily. Well, carrying capacity for any water bird is determined by the number of nesting sites you have that are acceptable for them. It's determined by the amount of food. Clutch size is down about 0.4 eggs per nest, and the size of the egg is down about 2%. So I haven't looked at it in other species, but I suspect that's a pretty common response. And when you don't have enough energy, you don't put as much energy into the egg. The young that is hatched is smaller, less fit, less likely to survive, that sort of thing. So you go to a cormorant colony and you will see a lot of algal growth right around the colony, and that's from the nutrients that the cormorants are putting back in the water. But those nutrients feed algae. And the algae feeds the zooplankton, and the zooplankton feed the fish. So I'm not sure that you can make the connection at a level of sufficient, I don't know if pollution is the right word, but sufficient feeding of cormorant feces to relate to any kind of a macro change in the lake, even a micro change. However, what I will tell you is that cormorant feces will destroy vegetation quickly. And there are many examples around the Great Lakes, and in those places I favor pushing the cormorants out where island vegetation has been eradicated. Goose Island down here near Cedarville is a good example of that. One of the national parks over in Canada, in Lake Erie, is an example of that. But other species of birds will do the same thing. Herons, black crown and great blue herons will do that. So will great egrets. So if we're going to kill cormorants, why don't we kill those birds too? And the answer is they're not blackbirds. They don't have the stigma associated with them. They don't have 3,000 years of antipathy, cultural antipathy on them. So that's my take.